Are you the chief doctor? The question landed with surgical precision cleaner than a scalpel, sharper than the antiseptic air that clung to the ICU. Nurse Riley's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. In a place where every sound meant urgency, a monitor, beeping a ventilator, sighing rubber soles, squeaking the weight of that question pierced through everything else. And for a moment, everything stopped. It was like the whole ward froze with me. Freeze frame. My hand still on the swinging glass door, my stethoscope brushing against my collarbone, my coat only half buttoned after sprinting from the parking lot. A drop of water, maybe rain, maybe sweat slid from my hairline down to my jaw and seemed to hang there. The words had the gravity of a gavel. They pulled me backward and forward at the same time. Backward into the living room where my mother Clara had once smiled thinly at me before a recital whispering, "Don't embarrass us." Backward into the kitchen where my father Victor folded the morning paper with the kind of finality that told me my voice wasn't needed. Backward into that suffocating dinner table, Elias seated in the spotlight, my achievements when they surfaced at all reframed as his stepping stones. Elias, the golden boy. The one who borrowed my essay on surgical innovation, copied it line by line, and submitted it under his name. The essay that won him the scholarship my hands, my mind, my sleepless nights had earned. At the award ceremony, I stood clapping from the audience, swallowing the bile that tasted like erasure, while he soaked in applause that wasn't his to keep. And yet the question also pulled me forward, into this white-tiled arena where merit wasn't wrapped in family bias or lacquered with cocktail party compliments. Here you were, as good as your scalpel, your judgment, your ability to hold steady when life itself trembled on a monitor. Here names didn't matter, only outcomes. Riley's eyes weren't casual. They carried expectation, trust, and something more dangerous, recognition. The recognition my family had denied me for 3 decades. Dr. Chen's face flashed in my mind, the soft crease of his eyes behind glasses, the pen scratching across a piece of lined paper he tore from his notebook. You see what others miss. Hold on to that. I had folded that note so many times the paper was translucent along its creases. I carried it through every exam, every night. I almost quit every time my parents said nothing at all while Elias was toasted. Now it was as though the ink of his words had burned itself onto my skin. Are you the chief doctor? Riley asked again, softer this time, but the room had already shifted. A resident was holding a chart waiting. Another nurse tightened an IV line, glancing toward me. Even the patient's labored breathing seemed synced to the silence before my answer. My throat closed for a fraction of a second, not from fear, but from the enormity of the moment. This wasn't just about a title. This was about undoing decades of silence, of invisibility, of being called nothing. Yes, I said. The word was clean, steady, absolute. I'm the chief. The freeze frame shattered. The room spun back into motion. Monitors, chime charts, flipped gloves snapped onto my wrists. A surgical mask stretched across my face, sealing the transformation. Riley nodded once sharp, like a soldier saluting, and placed the file in my hands. Inside the folder were numbers, vitals, images of damage drawn across the body of someone who needed me now. And suddenly, all the noise of my family, their criticisms, their erasures, their dismissals collapsed into background static. Here, there was no Clara's hissed warnings, no Victor's military standards, no Elias basking under lights. Here I was exactly what Riley had named me, the chief. As I stepped toward the patient's bed, I let the weight of that word anchor me. Every command I gave rippled outward, the team shifted in rhythm, a choreography of urgency and precision. And beneath it all, that single question still rang in my chest, reverberating louder than any insult, stronger than any silence. Are you the chief doctor? Yes, I always was. Every family has a way of announcing who matters and who doesn't. At Elias's 21st birthday, the house was dressed like a stage set. Crystal glasses lined the table chandelier, light scattering into shards across polished silverware, and the smell of roasted lamb heavy in the air. My mother Clara had orchestrated the seating chart with military precision. Elias sat dead center, his smile rehearsed, his future mapped. I was placed 2 chairs down, just far enough that the family photographer's lens would never quite catch me in focus. The laughter was thick, the kind of laughter that smooths over tension before it can spark. Waiters circled with trays of champagne bubbles rising like they had somewhere important to go. I kept my hands folded in my lap, rehearsing invisibility, the one role I had never failed at. Then my father Victor stood. His presence was enough to mute the room. A retired officer, he had the posture of a man who never laid down command even at a dinner table. He lifted his glass, the crystal trembling faintly under the chandelier. Every family has one great pride, he said, his voice low but carrying. Then came the pause, calculated, theatrical. And every family has one waist. The words struck like shrapnel. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then the laughter came. Sharp, easy, like a match to dry tinder. Some relatives laughed because they thought it was a joke. Others laughed because silence would have been too dangerous, too close to taking a side. Elias laughed hardest, tilting his head back, teeth catching the chandelier light like they'd been polished for this moment. I didn't laugh. I couldn't. My hands stayed steady on the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered edges as though holding onto the fabric would anchor me. My throat burned with the kind of heat that comes not from fire but from humiliation. No one said my name, but no one needed to. The arrow had been aimed for years, and this was just the moment my father decided to let it fly in public. My mother glanced at me for a fraction of a second, her lips twitching into that soft, polite smile she wore like armor. He didn't mean it. Her eyes seemed to say, but she didn't open her mouth. She adjusted Elias's cuff instead, making sure the golden boy's sleeve sat perfectly for the photographs. Aunt Meredith coughed lightly, murmuring something about family unity. Her words evaporated before they could land another attempt at camouflage rather than defense. No one stood up. No one contradicted him. My father's toast became gospel by default. I sat frozen, recording every detail like evidence. The condensation dripping down the side of my untouched glass. The faint squeak of a waiter's shoes on the marble. The way Elias leaned forward, soaking in the spotlight as if his brother's erasure was simply a prelude to his triumph. When the applause started, because yes, they applauded, I felt something shift inside me. Not break, not shatter, but shift like a fault line deciding it had carried enough weight. Later that night, after the last toast, after the last fake laugh, I slipped upstairs. The music throbbed through the floorboards, muted like a heartbeat too far away. In my room, I pulled out my planner, its spine cracked from years of use. Tucked inside was Dr. Chen's note, the one I carried like contraband. You see what others miss. Hold on to that. I traced the ink until my fingers smudged the edges. Then I wrote a new entry erased at Elias's 21st. Public record 1, pride 1, waste. It was my way of refusing to forget. If they wanted to turn me into a joke, I would make sure the evidence survived long after the laughter died. Because someday when the lights shifted, when the audience changed, when a nurse in an ICU asked me, "Are you the chief doctor?" I wanted to remember exactly where I had come from, and exactly how wrong they were. Have you ever been turned into the punchline of your own family story? Well, 1, yes, 0, no. Comment below, I want to hear your story. The glass was wrong. That was the first thing I noticed. A tall flute chilled its rim, sweating under the chandelier light, but filled not with champagne like the others, just ginger ale. Fizzing pale and thin bubbles fighting their way up as if they knew they didn't belong there. Someone had set it at my place before I even arrived. A courtesy, maybe. Or a reminder. The family was already gathered voices, tuned to the frequency of performance. Elias sat at the center again, his cufflinks catching the light laughter spilling from his lips like it had been scripted. My father's voice boomed over the table trading stories of honor and legacy. My mother's smile floated across the room, perfectly fixed, as if she could edit reality by simply refusing to acknowledge the cracks. And in front of me, the wrong glass. It wasn't just about the drink. It was about the message, the ritual of being miscast. Everyone else raised champagne that sparkled gold in the chandelier light. I raised ginger ale, the imposter, the stand-in, the permanent placeholder. Always a symbol of something that didn't quite fit. I pressed my fingers to the stem, feeling the coolness bite against my skin. The glass seemed to whisper what I already knew, no matter what I wore. No matter how well I performed, I was always 1 degree removed from belonging. I remembered being 12, handed a plastic cup at Thanksgiving, while my cousins clinked glass goblets. I remembered being 15, dressed for prom, borrowing a gown from a neighbor, my mother whispering, "Don't embarrass us," as she clipped a pin at the hem to hide the tear. I remembered being 20, watching Elias read my essay at the scholarship banquet. While I sipped water at the back of the room, the applause meant for me echoing through him. It was always like this. The wrong dress, the wrong seat, the wrong glass. The ginger ale fizzed a cheap imitation of celebration, and I couldn't help imagining the bubbles as voices, tiny, frantic, desperate to be heard, only to vanish at the surface. I knew what that felt like. My father raised his champagne. To Elias, he said, pride booming in his chest, the Lane family's future. Everyone lifted their glasses, crystal ringing like bells in a cathedral. I lifted mine too, the wrong one, and felt the hollow thud of it. No one noticed. No one cared that the note was off. To them, it was background noise. To me, it was proof. My mother caught my eye across the table. She didn't frown. She didn't apologize. She just tilted her head, a silent reminder, play along. Don't draw attention. Don't embarrass us. The laughter rose again, filling the room, filling my ears until I could barely breathe. I took a sip of the ginger ale. It was too sweet, cloying, coating my tongue with a syrup that tasted like falseness. It was the taste of being tolerated, not welcomed. Later, when the plates were cleared and the champagne bottles emptied, I slipped away. Upstairs in the quiet of my room, I set the glass down on my desk. The condensation left a perfect ring on the wood, a watermark of misplacement. I opened my planner, flipped to a fresh page, and wrote the wrong glass again. Beside the words, I tucked in Dr. Chen's note, the one he'd given me years ago. You see what others miss. Hold on to that. And I thought maybe that's why the wrong glass always finds me. Because I see it. Because I can't unsee it. That night I fell asleep replaying the sound of champagne glasses colliding in harmony, mine always half a beat off. It hurt, but it also hardened something in me. If they were determined to remind me I never fit, I would turn that reminder into record, into evidence, into proof that I didn't imagine it. Years later, standing in the ICU with Nurse Riley's question hanging in the air. "Are you the chief doctor?" I thought of that ginger ale. I thought of how it once made me feel invisible, wrong, erased. And I realized something startling. The wrong glass had never meant I didn't belong. It meant they didn't know what to pour for me. They couldn't imagine who I would become. So I raised my voice the way they had raised their champagne. Steady, unshakable, absolute. Yes, I told her, I'm the chief. And in that moment, the wrong glass shattered forever. Chiek li sairoi. Some victories arrive in silence. Mine came printed on crisp journal paper pages, heavy with the kind of weight that isn't measured in grams but in years. The day my first research paper was published, the hospital library smelled like dust and ink. I remember the clerk sliding the issue across the counter, her smile faint but real as she tapped the page where my name sat neatly below the title, Harper Lane, M.D. Those 3 letters shimmered like metals no one had ever pinned on me. It hadn't come easy. Nights hunched over data sets until my eyes blurred. Weekends spent in labs instead of family dinners. A dozen rejections folded into my planner like scars. But this time the editors said yes. This time my work wasn't invisible. When I walked back into the department lounge, my colleagues were waiting. Someone had taped a copy of the paper to the notice board. A cheer, rose claps, laughter voices echoing against the sterile white walls. "Dr. Lane, congratulations," one of the residents said, shaking my hand like I'd just crossed some finish line. Another colleague offered me coffee in a mug reserved for senior authors only. It wasn't official, but it felt like ceremony. I stood there, flushed my smile, shy but real. For once, the spotlight didn't burn, it warmed. This was mine. And yet when I called home that night, the line went flat. "Published?" My mother asked, her voice distracted. In the background, I could hear a cork popping, Elias's voice booming about a promotion at his firm. "That's nice, Harper. We're in the middle of dinner." My father didn't come to the phone. My mother's last words before she hung up were sharp, clipped, almost apologetic. "Don't get carried away with yourself." The silence after the call was louder than the applause had been. I sat on the edge of my bed, the paper copy of the journal balanced on my knees. The room hummed with the sound of the city outside, sirens, car horns, life moving on. But inside it was just me. The article and the knowledge that the people I wanted to call first had no interest in calling me back. I thought of Elias again. When he got his scholarship, the family threw a party. Balloons, champagne, a banner strung across the living room wall. When he landed his first job, my father gave a toast that lasted 10 minutes, filled with words like destiny and legacy. For me, nothing. I ran my fingers over the printed letters of my name until the ink smudged faintly. Proof lived there, even if no one at home acknowledged it. I tucked the journal into my planner next to Dr. Chen's note, the one that whispered, "You see what others miss. Hold on to that." Maybe that was the truth of it. I saw what others missed. I saw what my family refused to see. Later, back at the hospital, my colleagues asked when I'd be celebrating. "We should take you out," one suggested. I smiled, deflecting, pretending I had plans. But the truth was, celebration had always been foreign to me. I didn't know what it meant to be lifted, only what it meant to be erased. That night, I poured myself a glass of ginger ale, the same syrupy substitute I'd been handed at every family gathering. I lifted it anyway. To Harper, I whispered into the empty room. To the achievements no one sees. The fizz burned down my throat, bitter in its sweetness, but I didn't look away from my own reflection in the darkened window. For once, I clinked the glass against the silence. And years later, when Riley asked me in that ICU, "Are you the chief doctor?" I thought of this moment too. The applause that mattered, the silence that didn't. Because unseen achievements don't vanish. They wait, they accumulate, they build into something undeniable, something even a family can't erase. The table was already set when I walked in, though it wasn't a dinner table this time. No plates, no candles, no champagne flutes. Just a manila folder, dead center, its edges squared to the polished wood like someone had measured it with a ruler. A fountain pen rested neatly on top, waiting. My father stood at the head of the table, his posture as rigid as it had been in uniform. My mother hovered at his side, smile lacquered on as though this was another performance for the neighbors. Elias lounged nearby, golden boy at ease, tapping his glass like he was already toasting a future that would never include me. "Sit down, Harper," my father said. His voice was clipped official. I sat. The folder was slid across to me. Inside, the words blurred at first, contracts, transfers, and agreement written in legalese that boiled down to one thing: my exit. A rerouting of my inheritance, a stripping of my name from assets I hadn't even touched yet. They had arranged it so I would walk away with nothing except maybe the dignity of not causing a scene. "Just sign," my mother said softly, her nails tapping the folder's edge. "It'll be better for everyone. Don't embarrass us." That phrase again. Always that phrase. I looked around the table. My father's eyes were steel, unblinking. Elias smirked faintly as if the outcome was already decided. My mother's smile wavered, but only for a second before it reset into its familiar mask. No one in that room doubted I would obey. No one expected me to lift the pen and write my name any other way than small, compliant, forgotten. But my hand never moved. I thought of the wrong glass of ginger ale at Elias's birthday. Of the toast declaring one pride, one waste. Of the journal article with my name in print, celebrated everywhere but at this table. All the evidence stacked up like silent witnesses in my memory, waiting for me to call them to the stand. Instead, I pushed the folder back. "I won't sign," I said. The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's smile cracked. Elias rolled his eyes like my refusal was a minor inconvenience, not the fracture it really was. "You're making a mistake," my father said finally. "No," I answered, standing slowly. "I'm correcting one." I didn't slam the chair back. I didn't raise my voice. I wanted them to remember my leaving as quiet as the erasure they'd practiced for years, because silence can be sharp too. I walked to my room, each step deliberate, and pulled my old valise from the closet. It was scuffed at the corners, handle wrapped in tape, the kind of suitcase you don't pose with for photographs. I packed fast Scrubs journals, the folded note from Dr. Chen, the copy of my published paper, my planner, thick with evidence. No pictures, no heirlooms, no fragments of a family who had decided I was expendable. When I walked back through the living room, the contract still sat untouched on the table. My mother looked at me, lips trembling, as though she might finally speak the words I had needed my whole life. She didn't. She just smoothed the tablecloth as though arranging fabric could cover the gap I was about to leave. The front door clicked open under my hand. The night air outside was cold, sharper than the wine-scented warmth I left behind. I stepped through without looking back, the valise bumping against my leg, the weight of it both anchor and liberation. There was no shouting after me. No footsteps running to stop me. Only the hum of cicadas in the dark and the hollow echo of the door closing. That's how it ended, not with a fight, but with a silence I finally chose for myself. Years later, when Nurse Riley asked me in the ICU, "Are you the chief doctor?" I thought of that night. Of the contract unsigned. Of the valise packed in quiet defiance. Because walking away wasn't the end. It was the proof that I had always been more than what they tried to write in ink. Every life has a ledger. Mine lived inside a small wooden box I kept tucked at the back of my closet, its corners worn smooth from years of being pulled out in secret. I called it my receipts box, though no one else knew it existed. It wasn't filled with receipts from stores or restaurants. It was evidence. Proof that I wasn't the waste my father once toasted me as proof that my silence had never equaled failure. The box itself was nothing special. A thrift store find lid, slightly crooked, a brass hinge that squeaked when it opened. But what lived inside was sacred. The first layer was a certificate, my high school science fair award. It wasn't first place, just second, but the experiment had been mine alone. I had stayed up until dawn, soldering wires, my fingers burned from trial and error, while Elias had borrowed someone else's project and still managed to get his picture in the local paper. My parents never mentioned mine, but the ribbon was proof. Beneath that was a letterhead stamped in navy ink, my scholarship acceptance. The essay Elias had tried to steal had been reworked, rebuilt, written again from scratch after my heart had broken the first time. That letter meant more than money. It meant survival. I traced the signature at the bottom whenever I needed to remind myself I had gotten here by my own words, my own hands. There were smaller artifacts, too. A program from my first anatomy conference, my name buried in tiny font under presenters. A picture of me not centered, not smiling, just visible enough to prove I had stood in that room. I slipped it inside like a placeholder for all the other moments the family had cropped me out. But the most precious piece lay folded gently at the bottom, Dr. Chen's note. "You see what others miss. Hold on to that." The ink had faded over the years, the fold lines so deep they were almost scars. But those words had outlasted every insult. Every time my mother whispered, "Don't embarrass us." Every time my father praised Elias's smallest efforts and ignored my largest. Every time the family photo albums left a blank space where my face should have been. The receipts box became my archive of survival. When the world tried to tell me I was nothing, I could lift the lid and find evidence otherwise. Proof that my story was real, that my work had happened, that my worth didn't vanish just because they refused to acknowledge it. Some nights I sat on the floor with the box open items spread around me like pieces of a trial case. In my mind, I was both the defendant and the lawyer. I built my defense out of paper ribbon ink. Every artifact whispered back, "You mattered. You did this. They can't erase it." I didn't share the box with anyone, not colleagues, not friends, not even the rare people who tried to get close. It wasn't shame that kept me quiet. It was instinct. Evidence is safest when guarded. Years later, when I became chief of surgery, I added new items to the box. A badge with my title engraved. A thank you note from a patient's family, their shaky handwriting stronger than any award. And eventually, the ICU freeze frame itself. Nurse Riley's words burned into memory. "Are you the chief doctor?" If I could have bottled that moment, I would have placed it inside the box too. Because that's what the box was, my memory insurance policy. Against erasure. Against silence. Against being called waste again. I still keep it close. Not because I need to prove myself anymore, but because I never want to forget the years when proof was the only thing that kept me standing. Do you keep receipts? Letters? Notes or small proofs to remind yourself of your worth when others forget? 1. Yes, 0. No, share what you keep. The Greyhound carried secrets. Its engine droned like a low confession, steady and tired, rattling through the bones of everyone inside. The vinyl seats smelled of old sweat and disinfectant, stitched with scars from passengers who came and went before me. The windows were streaked with rain, each droplet dragged thin by the wind as the bus carved its way through blackened fields and forgotten towns. Gas stations blinked like lighthouses in the dark, each one passed without pause. This was no luxury journey, it was exile on wheels. I sat in the very back, the place you choose when you don't want to be seen. My duffel bag was jammed beneath the seat, stuffed with scrubs, a planner, and my receipts box. On my lap, the blue light of my phone cast a cold glow over my hands. The screen wasn't filled with congratulations or with questions about whether I was safe. It was filled with a single text message. Be realistic. Don't embarrass us. It had come minutes after I walked out of the house, suitcase handle, digging into my palm, the door closing with the finality of a gavel. Elias hadn't chased me, hadn't even raised his voice. He just sent that sentence as neat and sharp as if he'd carved it into stone. Be realistic. Don't embarrass us. The words looped in time with the bus's tires thrum. Thrum, thrum, thrum like a metronome keeping tempo for humiliation. They weren't new. They were just the latest draft of a line I had been hearing all my life. My mother's whisper before school recitals. My father's clipped warning before I left for college interviews. My aunt's sigh when I spoke up too loud at Thanksgiving. Now Elias's text was only the newest voice in the chorus. I should have deleted it. Rationally, I knew that. But there was something in me that couldn't. My thumb hovered over the screen, tempted to swipe it away, erase the bruise. Instead, I read it again. And again. It was like pressing on a wound, not because you like the pain, but because you need to know it's still there, that it's real. A baby whimpered 3 rows up. The driver coughed into the static of the radio. An old man in a ball cap snored against the window, breath fogging the glass. The rest of the world kept moving indifferent while I sat suspended in that cruel little sentence. Be realistic. Was it realistic to work 12-hour shifts and still publish my first paper? Was it realistic to outscore Elias on every exam only to watch him steal my words and my spotlight? Was it realistic to survive on scholarships when my family cut me out of their narrative? If that was realism, then I had already lived it. But what Elias meant wasn't realism. He meant obedience. He meant stay small, stay invisible. Don't show them we have a flaw in the family photograph. I opened my planner. The paper was worn pages filled with cramped notes and small rebellions. I copied the text onto a fresh page. Be realistic. Don't embarrass us. Not as warning, not as prophecy, as evidence. It would sit there alongside every other artifact in my receipts box. The second-place ribbon, no one mentioned the scholarship letter. No one celebrated Dr. Chen's handwritten note that said, "You see what others miss." Hold on to that. 2 voices now. One commanding me to shrink, one reminding me to see. The bus slowed, hissed, and picked up new passengers at a dim station where fluorescent lights buzzed like hornets. I caught my reflection in the window as we pulled away again. Faint blurred, but undeniably there. I pressed my fingers to the glass as if to prove to myself that I hadn't disappeared. My phone buzzed once more. Another text. It's not too late to sign. Don't ruin this for us. I didn't reply. Instead, I turned off the screen and let the darkness swallow his words. But I didn't delete them. Deletion was erasure, and I knew too well what erasure felt like. I let the phone go dark and tucked it into the planner. That message would live there, not as a command, but as a receipt. The bus roared louder as it climbed an overpass. I leaned back, duffel pressing against my feet, planner warm in my lap, and whispered into the hum of the engine. Be realistic, watch me. The words weren't loud, but they didn't have to be. The bus carried them forward over the fields, past the gas stations, into the night where no one could silence them. And years later, standing in the ICU under fluorescent light, Nurse Riley's question, "Are you the chief doctor?" sounded like the answer I had been writing toward all along. Some betrayals don't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. They arrive with a chime, an email notification, soft and ordinary, a sound that should mean nothing. But that night in the library, it was the sound of my world cracking. The library was almost empty, just the faint smell of old paper and disinfectant hanging in the air. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the only sound besides the steady hum of the radiator. I was 19, shoulders hunched over my textbooks, fingers cramped from hours of note-taking. When the chime sounded on the row of communal computers behind me, I almost ignored it. But my eyes drifted. Elias's name was on the login screen. He'd been careless again, leaving his account open. I shouldn't have looked. That's what I told myself, even as my hand reached for the mouse as the cursor drifted over the glowing envelope icon. One click. That was all. One click and the subject line leapt out. "Congratulations, Elias Lane, recipient of the Lane Fellowship." My stomach dropped, my skin prickling hot and cold at once. I opened the email and the words unrolled like a verdict. "Your essay moved us with its honesty, its clarity, its passion for medicine. We are honored to support your future." My eyes froze on the essay attached. I knew those sentences. I had lived them, written them, revised them until my hands shook and my vision blurred. Growing up in silence teaches you to listen. Medicine taught me that listening can save lives. Those were my words, my metaphors. Even the misplaced comma after silence, the one I had meant to fix but never did. The world split in two. On the left side of the library screen, the email with Elias's name at the top. On the right, flashing in my memory, my original Word document time-stamped weeks earlier, identical paragraph after paragraph. A split screen in my mind, my truth, his theft. I stared so long my eyes watered. The cursor blinked at me as if taunting me, "Say something. Print it. Take it to the dean. Take it to your parents. Fight." But I already knew how that story ended. If I confronted Elias, he'd grin, shrug, maybe even call it a misunderstanding. If I told my father, he'd say I was mistaken, or worse, accuse me of jealousy. My mother would smooth her skirt, whisper her favorite line, "Don't embarrass us." Aunt Meredith would murmur something neutral about family harmony. And in the end, the committee's applause would drown me out. So I sat there, frozen, memorizing every detail, the subject line, the timestamp, the phrasing that was mine but no longer belonged to me. I made my memory into a camera because if no one else believed me, at least I could keep the evidence alive. The library clock ticked loudly each second, hammering in the realization my first great opportunity had been stolen before it even had a chance to bloom. I walked back to my dorm in silence, the winter air biting at my cheeks, the glow of street lamps smearing across the pavement like bruises. Inside, I pulled out my planner and wrote the words carefully. Stolen grant. Essay lifted. No one will believe me. The ink bled slightly on the page, like even the paper knew the weight of the truth. Then I reached for the most fragile thing I owned, Dr. Chen's note folded so many times the creases had almost worn through. "You see what others miss. Hold on to that." I pressed it against my chest, whispering, "I saw it. I won't forget." The next day, Elias walked into the kitchen at home with the congratulatory letter in hand. My father clapped him on the back, chest puffed with pride. My mother kissed his cheek, beaming as if her son had cured cancer. Champagne corks popped, laughter echoed, toasts rang out. "To Elias, the future of the Lane family," my father declared. I stood in the corner glass of ginger ale, sweating in my hand, the wrong glass again, watching as the thief was crowned. No one looked at me. No one even noticed. But in my mind, the split screen hovered sharper than ever. On one side, the printed email, his name in bold. On the other, my essay, my words, my life. Two truths laid side by side, undeniable. It should have broken me. And in some ways it did. That night, I cried alone, silent sobs into the sleeve of my sweater so no one would hear. But something else hardened. If they were determined to erase me, then I would learn to become my own archivist, my own witness, my own record keeper. So I built the receipts box, I folded the planner entry inside it. I clipped a printed copy of my essay timestamp visible and tucked it beneath the second-place science ribbon. I layered my life in artifacts, knowing one day they might be all I had left to prove I was never the waste. Years later, standing in the ICU, nurse Riley asked, "Are you the chief doctor?" And the split screen replayed. For a moment, I saw that library computer and my essay glowing side by side. But this time, the name at the top wasn't his. It was mine, stitched into the coat I wore, spoken in the halls where lives hung in the balance. And that was the truth no one could steal. Seattle didn't know my name when I arrived. That was the gift. The rain was steady the day I stepped off the plane, my duffel digging into my shoulder, the city smelling of salt asphalt and coffee. Nobody cared who my family was. Nobody whispered, "Don't embarrass us." Nobody tilted their glass to toast Elias while pretending not to see me. Seattle was a place where anonymity wasn't a punishment. It was oxygen. I rented a studio barely big enough for a bed and a desk, the kind of space where silence echoed against thin walls. At night, I ate takeout from cartons balanced on my knees, medical textbooks spread around me like a fortress. I worked shifts that blurred into dawn, my body running on caffeine and stubbornness. There were days I thought I might collapse, nights. I pressed my face into my pillow and asked myself if my family was right, that maybe I was wasting my life. But every morning I stood up. Every surgery, every rotation, every late-night chart review became another layer of armor. My colleagues didn't know about the stolen essay or the toast where I'd been called a waste. They only knew the steadiness of my hands, the clarity of my calls in an operating room, the way I stayed until the work was finished. Slowly, quietly, a reputation began to take shape. I never bragged. I didn't have the luxury. I carried my receipts box with me instead. The folded note from Dr. Chen. The scholarship letter no one at home acknowledged. My first published paper. Each artifact whispered to me in the still hours, "Keep going. Keep building." And so I built. I built in empty cafeterias, scribbling notes while the city slept. I built in the OR, calling for scalpels with a voice that didn't shake. I built in the margins of exhaustion, carving out a life brick by brick while my family cropped me out of theirs. Years passed. Promotions trickled in. Dr. Lane attending. Dr. Lane department lead. Each new title felt unreal, like clothes tailored for someone else. I half expected them to be taken away the moment I wore them. But no one came. No one told me to stop. No one said, "Be realistic." The day the board named me chief of surgery, the announcement came in a conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and whiteboard markers. My colleagues applauded their hands, warm, genuine, uncalculated. A few clapped me on the back. One nurse wiped her eyes. It was nothing like the applause my brother had bathed in hollow and rehearsed. This applause belonged to me. After the meeting, I slipped into the stairwell alone. The cement walls were cold, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, but I pulled out my phone anyway. For a moment, I hovered over my family's group chat, the one I'd been removed from years earlier. I almost typed the news, almost offered them proof that their waste had become chief. But I didn't. Instead, I opened my planner and wrote the words in neat block letters: Seattle, Chief Surgeon, built elsewhere. Then I slid the page into my receipts box, tucking it alongside Dr. Chen's note. Because the truth was this: I didn't build for them. I built in spite of them. I built for the version of myself who had sat in a Greyhound bus seat clutching a text from Elias that said, "Don't embarrass us." I built for the 19-year-old who discovered her stolen essay glowing on someone else's screen. I built for the girl who once raised a glass of ginger ale at a table full of champagne. Seattle gave me something my family never could: a clean slate. And on it, I carved my name deep enough that no one could erase it. So when Nurse Riley's question rang in that ICU, "Are you the chief doctor?" I already knew the answer. Because I had built it elsewhere, brick by brick, until it became undeniable. The ICU was built for noise monitors, chiming ventilators, sighing rubber soles squeaking against tile. But the moment Nurse Riley spoke, the whole room seemed to stop breathing. She looked up from Elias's chart eyes, flicking between me and the family gathered behind the glass. My coat was freshly pressed badge, clipped at my chest, letters engraved clear enough for anyone to read. But it wasn't the badge that made her pause. It was the authority in my voice when I asked for vitals, the way the staff shifted slightly closer, waiting for my command. Riley hesitated, then asked the question that split the air like glass breaking. "Wait, are you the chief doctor?" The words carried farther than she intended. They ricocheted down the corridor through the glass wall of the waiting area, straight into the ears of the people I once called family. I didn't turn immediately, but I felt their stares land heavy on my back. My father's posture, once unshakable, stiffened as though someone had pulled a thread too tight. My mother's lacquered smile froze mid-curve, the kind of smile she always used to smooth over fractures. And Elias, unconscious behind me, couldn't perform his role as Golden Boy anymore. The machines spoke for him, each beep a reminder of how fragile pride can be. For years, they had introduced me as nothing. They had toasted Elias as the Lane family's pride while my name was erased from albums and anniversaries. They had whispered warnings about not embarrassing them as though my existence was shame. And now, in a sterile room under fluorescent light, a nurse's simple question had undone all of it. "Are you the chief doctor?" Riley asked again, quieter this time, as if testing whether the truth would hold. "Yes," I said. My voice didn't waver. It was steady, surgical, sharp as a scalpel. "I am." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, saturated with everything left unsaid. The other staff froze, sensing the tension but pretending to be busy. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear. My father shifted his weight as if standing on new ground he couldn't control. My mother pressed her lips together until they turned pale. Aunt Meredith, seated in the corner, lowered her gaze, but not before I caught the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She had always known the truth, even if she never spoke it. For once, the power wasn't theirs. Riley nodded and handed me the chart, her gesture small but seismic. In that moment, I wasn't the erased daughter. I wasn't the waste. I was the surgeon in charge of their son's life. Their pride lay on the bed, kept alive by tubes and machines, while their so-called embarrassment held the authority they couldn't deny. The silence in the waiting room thickened until it felt like glass pressing against my chest. I didn't look at them, not fully, but in the reflection of the ICU window, I saw it all. My father's jaw clenched, my mother's hands, twisting the strap of her bag. Meredith's stillness, the absence of Elias's voice. For the first time, I wasn't the one out of place. They were. I stepped closer to the bed, issued instructions to the residents, adjusted an IV line with practiced calm. Every movement was deliberate, precise, undeniable. Proof in motion. The family who once refused to see me now had no choice. When I finally turned, their eyes flinched as if I had caught them watching. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. My mother looked down at her lap. No one spoke. No one could. The roles had shifted. Permanently. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to remind them of the toasts, the stolen essay, the ginger ale in the wrong glass. The silence was enough. It was the kind of silence that didn't erase it exposed. And I walked forward, not toward them, but past them down the hall where the light stretched ahead like a corridor I had built for myself. For once, I wasn't leaving in shame. I was leaving in authority. If you returned to face the very people who once erased you, this time with a new title, new power, would you stop to speak or would you keep walking? 1, stop, 0, walk. My mother never asked to meet me in a hospital hallway. That would have implied urgency, maybe even humility. Instead, she chose a cafe 2 blocks away, one of those polished places with marble counters and latte art shaped like hearts. She arrived 10 minutes early, as if this were a luncheon with friends, not the first time in years she had asked me to sit across from her. Clara Lane had perfected the art of looking untouched. Her hair was smooth, her blouse crisp, her smile ready for anyone who glanced her way. If you didn't know her, you might think she was a woman simply enjoying her coffee. But I did know her. And I knew that when she asked me here, it wasn't for reconciliation. It was for negotiation. She slid a cup across the table toward me. Ginger latte, no foam. The same drink I used to order in medical school. That detail almost disarmed me until I remembered she wasn't reaching for memory. She was reaching for leverage. "Harper," she said, leaning forward slightly, voice calm as ever. "This family has been through enough. You've proven yourself. We all see that now." I didn't answer. Her hands folded neatly over one another, the diamond on her ring catching the light. Elias needs stability. This hospital is, how do I put it, exposing us. There are reporters asking questions, board members whispering. It would be best if he were moved. To a private clinic. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere discreet. There it was. Not an apology. Not a confession of years spent erasing me. Not even an acknowledgement of the ICU silence when Riley called me chief. Just another transaction, polished and precise. She wanted me to use my authority, my title, the reputation I had built alone to clean up the mess her golden son had become. You're asking me to transfer Elias. I said, my tone flat. Her smile didn't break. You're his sister. No. I shook my head slowly. I'm his surgeon. That's different. For a flicker of a second, the smile faltered, but then it returned, practiced and resilient. Think of the family, Harper. Think of what people will say if he stays here, if his condition is discussed in open halls. Privacy is priceless. It wasn't about Elias's recovery. It never was. It was about optics. About keeping the lane name polished, even if it meant dragging me back into the machinery of silence. I looked down at the cup she'd slid toward me. The latte art heart was already dissolving the foam, collapsing into a swirl of brown. Perfect on the surface, disintegration underneath. Just like us. Do you remember, I asked quietly, the day Dad raised his glass and called me a waste? Her shoulders stiffened. That was years ago. He didn't mean it. Yes, he did. I said, meeting her eyes. And so did you. Every time you told me not to embarrass you. Every time you smiled instead of speaking. You all meant it. Her lips parted, but no words came. The silence between us grew thick. You don't want me here because I can help Elias? I continued. You want me here because my presence embarrasses you less than his failure does. The cafe noise swelled around us, cups clinking, the hiss of milk, steaming laughter from a nearby table. Life went on indifferent. Finally, she leaned back her mask, slipping just enough to show the steel beneath. Families are complicated, Harper. We do what we must. And I've done what I must, I replied. I built elsewhere. I became what you told me I couldn't. And I will treat Elias as my patient. But I won't clean your image. That transaction is closed. Her eyes hardened, but she didn't argue. She simply lifted her cup, sipped her coffee, and let the silence say the rest. When I stood, the chair scraped loudly against the tile heads, turning briefly before returning to their own lives. I walked out into the drizzle coat collar, pulled high, the planner heavy in my bag. Behind me, my mother sat in a perfect cafe scene latte and hand diamond glinting, the performance intact. But for the first time, she hadn't made the deal she wanted. The envelope arrived on an ordinary morning, slipped between hospital newsletters and utility bills so unremarkable it could have been overlooked. But the moment I saw the government seal in the corner, my pulse shifted. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it already knew it carried something corrosive. I tore it open at the desk in my apartment, the window fogged with Seattle drizzle, the smell of stale coffee lingering from the night before. One page, crisp, stamped official. The words unfolded in their careful bureaucratic cadence, but the meaning struck instantly. My name had been used without my consent. I had, according to this document, agreed to sponsor a visa application. The letter was polite in its formality, but my blood turned cold when I saw the details. The signature? The date. My name scrawled as guarantor for a petition I had never seen. For a long time, I just sat there staring at the page. The forged signature was close, I'll give them that. Loops mimicked letters tightened as though someone had practiced. My father's precision lingered in the strokes. I could imagine him guiding the pen soldierly in his control. My mother smoothing the form across the table afterward, murmuring about necessity, optics, reputation. Perhaps Elias smirking in the background, finding the whole thing amusing, using me when it suited them, discarding me when it didn't. They had always erased me. Now they had resurrected me on paper, not as a daughter, not as a surgeon, but as a resource. A signature. The irony cut deep. After all the years of being invisible, suddenly I was useful not for who I was, but for the credibility attached to my name. It wasn't recognition. It was theft all over again. Another essay stolen, another toast silencing me. I laid the letter flat on my desk, then reached instinctively for my planner. My hands didn't tremble. They were steady, surgical, deliberate. On a fresh page, I wrote in block letters, unauthorized visa application, name forged, government letter received. I underlined it twice. This wasn't just a memory. This was evidence. I opened the receipts box, the small wooden container at the back of my closet, its brass hinge squeaking faintly. Inside lay the archive of my survival. The high school ribbon, no one mentioned the scholarship letter. No one celebrated the faded conference program with my name in tiny print. At the bottom, folded so thin the paper was nearly translucent, rested Dr. Chen's note. You see what others miss. Hold on to that. I added the government letter to the collection. Not with ceremony, but with precision. Another artifact, another proof. Then I turned back to my desk and drafted my response. The words came clean, sharp, free of emotion. I had learned long ago that outrage only fueled their narrative. What cut deeper than anger was clarity. To whom it may concern, Dr. Harper Lane did not authorize, request, or consent to the sponsorship referenced in your letter. The signature provided is false. I respectfully request that this matter be investigated and corrected immediately. Please find attached copies of my identification as proof of authenticity. I signed my real name at the bottom, each letter deliberate, every loop and line sharp enough to slice through doubt. Then I photocopied the page 3 times. One for the file I mailed back, one for legal counsel should it come to that, and one for the witness file, the thick binder I had begun building quietly, the one that lived beside the receipts box. The witness file was different from the box. The box was for survival, for memory. The file was for war. Plastic sleeves, tab dividers, chronological order. A system. A record strong enough to stand when memory would be dismissed as emotion, when words would be twisted into unreliability. Sliding the copy into the binder, I felt the quiet satisfaction of permanence. It wasn't triumph. There was nothing triumphant about discovering my name misused, my identity forged. But it was a kind of steadiness, the reassurance that no matter how many times they tried to overwrite me, I would always have the record. That night, I sat at the window with the city lights smeared in rain and thought about the audacity of it. The very family that had called me waste now wielded my name as collateral. They hadn't apologized. They hadn't asked. They had simply written me and assuming my silence, assuming my compliance. But silence, I had learned, could be weaponized in more than one way. I folded the original letter and returned it to the box, the hinge squeaking closed. Outside, the rain pressed steady against the glass, a drumbeat reminding me that some things, no matter how small, could not be erased once they were written down. And in that moment, I promised myself this. If they wanted my name on paper, then they would have it, but not as their guarantor, not as their signature. They would have it as their witness. The one record they couldn't forge, couldn't edit, couldn't bury. The family had turned me into a transaction. I had turned myself into evidence. Truth in my family was always something to be trimmed, polished, or hidden under a smile. It never came directly. It came in half phrases and silences, in the way my mother smoothed tablecloths, or the way my father cleared his throat. So when it finally arrived, blunt and unvarnished, it didn't come from them at all. It came from someone on the edges. It was late evening when Aunt Meredith asked me to walk with her. The hospital cafeteria had closed hours before, and the hallways hummed with the sterile quiet of night shift. She carried 2 paper cups of tea, handed one to me without ceremony, and led me outside to the small smoking patio, though neither of us smoked. The sky above was dark velvet punctured by hospital floodlights. For a long while, she said nothing. She was always the trongtai, the referee in family disputes, the one who managed to stay in the room without choosing a side. Neutral, composed, untouchable. I had grown used to her silence, her evasions, the way she could turn any conversation into wallpaper. But that night, she broke pattern. They feared you'd outgrow Elias. The words hung between us heavier than the steam rising from our cups. My chest tightened as though I'd been struck with a scalpel where I least expected it. What? My voice came out sharper than intended. She looked at me steady, unflinching. Your parents, even Elias himself, they saw it coming. You were steadier, sharper. You worked harder. They knew one day you'd surpass him, and they couldn't stand it. So they clipped you early, cut your lines before you could rise, called you waste before you could prove them wrong. It wasn't that you failed them, Harper. It was that you threatened them. The world tilted. For years, I had carried the weight of their verdict that I was less, that I was invisible, that I was somehow undeserving. I had swallowed their laughter, their indifference, their erasures until it calcified inside me like bone. But hearing it named out loud that their cruelty had been strategy, not truth, was like oxygen rushing into starved lungs. I didn't answer right away. My hands tightened around the paper cup until it warped. In my mind, images flickered my father's toast at Elias's birthday, declaring one pride, one waste. My mother's soft warning, don't embarrass us. Elias's smirk as he accepted applause meant for me. All of it now reframed, revealed not as evidence of my failure, but of their fear. Meredith sipped her tea, unbothered by my silence. You needed to hear it, she said simply. I should have told you sooner. Her voice wasn't apologetic. It wasn't even particularly kind, but it was honest. And honesty in my family was rarer than love. I stared out at the parking lot, rows of cars gleaming under harsh lights, each one a small capsule of someone else's life. I thought about how many years I had wasted trying to become visible to people who had already decided I shouldn't be. How many nights I had opened my receipts box looking for proof that I was not nothing. And now, in one sentence, Meredith had confirmed it. I was never nothing. I was too much. It didn't undo the years. It didn't soften the scars. But it shifted something. The ledger of my life tilted, and suddenly the math made sense. They feared you'd outgrow Elias. The line echoed through me again and again until it carved its own place alongside Dr. Chen's note, the stolen essay, the forged visa letter. Another receipt. Not on paper, but in memory. Testimony from a witness who finally spoke. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to defend myself. I didn't need to explain, to argue, to prove. The truth had been said out loud, and that was enough. I finished my tea lukewarm now and stood. Meredith stayed seated, eyes on me, unreadable. I didn't thank her, not because I wasn't grateful, but because gratitude felt too small for what had just happened. Instead, I nodded once sharp and walked back toward the hospital doors. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed as always, the smell of antiseptic curled through the air, and my father still sat in the waiting room pretending control. But I carried something they couldn't take from me, their secret spoken plain. For the first time, the silence didn't own me. I owned it. The ballroom smelled faintly of coffee and stage lights, that strange mix of caffeine and electricity that clings to conferences. Rows of chairs fanned out before me, filled with surgeons, residents, and students in crisp blazers, their lanyards glinting under the chandeliers. The hum of conversation died as I stepped up to the podium. I had spoken at medical conferences before, but this one was different. This wasn't a case presentation or a surgical innovation panel. This was closing remarks, the kind people would quote, the kind that would be printed in programs and replayed on hospital intranets. The kind where the weight of your name either expanded or shrank when you left the stage. For years, my family had tried to make sure mine always shrank. I adjusted the microphone. My reflection caught faintly in the glass of the teleprompter, and for a heartbeat, I saw not the surgeon standing there now, but the girl with the wrong glass of ginger ale at a champagne toast. The student watching her essay glow in someone else's inbox. The daughter listening to her father declare, one pride, one waste. They had written their verdict of me early and often. They had erased me with silences, cropped me out of photos, used my name only when it benefited them. And for years, I believed them. I believed invisibility was proof of failure. I believed waste was my inheritance. But standing at that podium, the evidence of my life weighed differently. My receipts box heavy with artifacts, the high school ribbon, the scholarship letter, the journal publication. Dr. Chen's folded note. Even the government letter where my name was forged, now sealed in a witness file as proof of their desperation. And the ICU where Nurse Riley's words, "Are you the chief doctor?" rang out louder than every silence combined. I looked over the audience, hundreds of eyes reflecting back. Not family eyes, not eyes trained to erase. These were colleagues, peers, students who had only ever known me as the surgeon who stayed until the last suture was tied, the chief who carried receipts not for applause, but for accountability. The speech I had written was neatly typed in the folder on the podium. But I didn't open it. "Closure," I said, my voice steady, filling the hall, "isn't something they give you." The words rolled through the room, crisp and deliberate. I saw people straighten in their seats. "It's something you decide you deserve." I let the sentence breathe. Let it echo. Let it land. Because I hadn't been given closure. My father had never recanted. My mother had never apologized. Elias had never admitted the thefts, the smirks, the way he stood on scaffolds built with my work. They had never handed me recognition. They had never offered worth. But I had taken it anyway. Built it elsewhere. Proved it in ORs and journals and in the eyes of patients who whispered thank you when their voices were too weak to rise. My worth had never belonged to them, and closure had never been theirs to grant. Applause swelled, not polite, not obligatory, but sustained, genuine. A sound that filled the cavernous ballroom and washed over me. I stepped back from the podium, not needing to say anything else. The truth was complete in its simplicity. As I walked off stage, the lights dimmed and the screen behind me shifted to the end-card playlist, receipts, and reclamation. And for the first time in my life, I realized I had written my own ending. Not cropped, not silenced, not erased, reclaimed,